I have my tank that we've used before in this scene. You can see when I render this, do a quick render here. Ignore that background, we'll get to that. Here's a quick render. You'll see the textures on the tank are nice and tight and look as though they're the correct scale to the tank. Now, texture maps can be any scale. When we put them on an object, they'll usually go onto the object or map onto the object to fit the entire object, and that may not be what we want. You can see here in my scene, if I zoom out, my tank is sitting on a giant plane. There. The texture map's going to, by default, fit right into this whole plane, and it's going to get really stretched. Now, I have the plane selected. If you don't have it already selected, you'll want to click on it. Scoot this over so it looks like yours. Click on the plane so it turns white. I've also got edged faces on so that we can see the plane. And I'm going to go to Modify, and I'm going to add a UVW map. You don't have to. The plane already has mapping, but it's what I showed you before, so we might as well stick with what we've already done. And now the plane has planar mapping on it. The planar mapping, again, if I zoom out, is, you can see the gizmo here going around it. It's coming down from the top. We'll zoom back in. So I have mapping on the plane. At this point, we can go to our material editor. I've set this scene up, 5006 max. This scene is set up with 6 texture maps that you can use, and I'm going to take these texture maps, one of them, this one, and I'm going to drag it over here to my surface. Now if I render this scene, scoot these guys over, actually I'm going to minimize that. If I render this scene, you'll see that the background is too big of a scale, the texture, to match my tank. These are each pixels here. You can see these pixels are like a foot wide. It almost looks like a tile floor. And that's because if I zoom out again, you'll see the entire map has been mapped to the plane. It's an easy thing to fix. We just go to, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit more. We just go to our tiling, and I'm going to tile it 20 in one direction and 20 in on the V. And now if I render this, you'll see that it will tighten that texture map up to be a little closer we want. Now those rocks are still pretty darn big. How about 30 by 30? There we go. That's a little better. And now I've got a texture map that matches kind of the scale of my tank. Once you've got it set up the way you want it with the correct scale and the correct tiling, then you can actually add any map that you want, and the scale will stay the same because the UV mapping is the same on all of them. You'll notice that these textures with details, like these cracks, are going to tile. In other words, we're going to see the little squares that make up each texture map as it tiles along. I think it's really obvious on this one. Oops, can't drag it into a render. There we go. It's really obvious on this one. You'll see that it turns into like wallpaper or a repeating pattern. Usually we don't want that for our ground plane, so what we tend to use, I keep dragging it into the render, I'm confusing myself. We usually use a planar texture map, planar meaning not as much detail. And you'll see that this one works well for this scene because it's a little bit blander and the tank will show up a little bit more. We're not adding so much detail into our scene. So now if I render this with the tank bigger, we have a nice ground plane in there that matches the scale of our tank. So just be careful when you put textures in. You don't want one texture on one part of your scene to be really big and not tiled while other textures are. Just try to get the pixel aspect ratio the same throughout the entire render. It'll look a lot better and it's a lot more professional that way. Okay?